to Kali Tribune podcast. This episode is called What is Not Metaphysics? Of course, this is a paraphrase of the title of the lecture by Martin Heidegger held in Freiburg on 1929. The lecture is called Was ist Metaphysik? What is Metaphysics? But don't worry, those of you who are not experts in Heidegger, this will not be some exhaustive critique of Heidegger's lecture, but we'll use it as a launching pad, so to speak, for our discussion. The reason for this is that Heidegger, in the course of this lecture, poses a question. That is to say, he quotes a question posed by Leibniz. This question he considers a fundamental question of metaphysics, that is to say, the question that defines more or less what metaphysics is. In this podcast, we'll try to show in a very brief sketch that this is false, that the Heidegger's understanding of fundamental question of metaphysics has very little to do with metaphysics in general. So it will not be really a critique of Heidegger, but a standpoint that is very prevalent in our day and age and is exemplified by Heidegger's approach. Now, what is this question? Well, it goes like this. Leibniz, in his treatise on the principles of nature and grace, writes, "Why is there being and not rather nothing?" Or, in other words, why is there something rather than nothing, where both something and nothing are taken in a general sense. Now, people who uncritically just accept this question as a fundamental metaphysical question rarely read Leibniz and still more rarely compare Leibniz's method in philosophy to the method in philosophy that was applied in pre-modern times. The thing is that Leibniz relies on assumption that everything that is has a sufficient reason. This means that if I know sufficient reason of A, then I know what A is. For example, if I know why Earth revolves around the Sun, then I know in a sense what this situation of state of things, of relation of these two celestial bodies is. I know sufficient reason for their behavior, so to speak. Now, Leibniz just then goes further and asks for the sufficient reason of the being in general, being, as Aristotle would put it. What Heidegger does is take this assumption of Leibniz, denounce it as not really fundamental enough, because for Heidegger metaphysics is not a fundamental way of asking the question. It is more like something that obfuscates the real question. The proposition, by the way, I deem completely and entirely wrong, which is not the issue now in respect of Heidegger specifically. But there is a cardinal, crucial, and fatal flaw in this. Namely, the quest for sufficient reason in Leibniz, in context of Leibniz's way of thinking, of early modernity, of the inception of modern age, is not the same as the way this question was posed before. To wit, metaphysics originally does not inquire about sufficient reasons. It inquires about causes. in Greek, aitia, and principles in Greek are he. This is not the same, and now we'll try to demonstrate why. Namely, Leibniz sees sufficient reason as absolutely valid principle for everything in general, based on the harmony that is observable not in things, or not so much in things, in causes and effects of things, but in natural laws. That is to say, natural law, for example, that regulates the behavior of celestial bodies, displays sufficient reason, and therefore he can, and I'm of course simplifying this quite a bit, but I think I'm still true to his intentions. We can therefore justify an ultimate sufficient reason that produced all these natural laws, and this is God. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, simply that metaphysics originally never asked about this. More specifically, Aristotle's ta physica, that is to say, philosophy of nature or contemplation of natural causes and principles, has nothing to do with this. I would be so bold to assert that there is a wrong assumption that is rather prevalent amongst the not very reflective historians and some natural scientists, that Aristotle's approach was some kind of proto-science, proto-natural science, where he just laid the foundations for science of nature, that is to say physics, that later moved on forward and abandoned his insights. I don't see how this applies at all, because Aristotle physics has little or nothing to do with modern science, because the intent behind it, that is also expressed in a very peculiar way of posing questions, is completely different. Aristotle never, not in a single passage, talks about natural laws. He doesn't talk about events even. He talks about causes, and he talks about principles. This is something that modern or the contemporary natural science does not do. The reason why there is this difference, and why it is hard to see, is the nature of what the cause is. Aristotle calls the cause something that is, in Greek, the answer to the question ex hou, from what. This does not mean in the sense that from what it is constituted something. It can mean that, but only in a very restricted sense of material cause. The real general meaning of this is where it comes from, let's say. Because cause is, in fact, a mode of origin, a way of being originated. And this is the reason why, this is the way we have to think about causes in metaphysical sense. So Heidegger, for instance, who wants to abandon this so-called causal understanding of metaphysics, where behind being as being in general, there is a cause why it is such and such and so on and so forth. But he is in fact unable to do it, because this seems to be natural for human mind. Now let us see what Aristotle says. We said that Leibniz's question is not fundamental. One other argument for it not being fundamental is this: it was not present. It was not historically present before inception of modern age. By inception, I mean what we in Croatian call novi vijek. The translation would be new age in English, but I don't mean new age as 20th, 19th century new age movement, but age that is in fact preparation for modernity, and Leibniz lived at that time. 17th century to 18th century, and then 19th century. 19th century is already modernity proper. Aristotle says that when something is natural, this means that it comes to pass always or for the most part, in most instances. The reason why it doesn't happen 100% always is that everything coming to pass in nature is susceptible to deficiencies of its matter. Everything has some form of matter, and matter is a cause, or is a principle, let's say, that is not by its very definition is perfectible, but never perfect, because once it would be perfected to its utmost, that is to say, formed turned into something completely intelligible, it would not be matter anymore. Very simple. So everything in nature has matter, and no matter that every natural cause seeks to intents, as they would say in Middle Ages, where intention does not have in this context any subjective sense. Although every natural cause intends an effect that is perfectly similar to it, because, as Aristotle says, man gives birth to man, meaning that every cause produces something that is as much as possible alike it. Likeness is a real causal nexus between two things in this traditional way of thinking. It can never fulfill it absolutely, and there are deficiencies, even to an extent that deficiency can defeat the purpose of the effect. For instance, in deformities in human beings, whereas, for instance, the intellect is the essential difference that makes human in a sense, in a context of nature. But you can have human beings that because of bodily corporeal deficiencies and physiological deficiencies are unable to enact the proper operation or proper energeia of the intellect through their bodies. So it is not, in their individual instance, it is not fulfilled as it should be fulfilled. I'm, of course, talking about the context of nature. Nature is not the only, the totality of the world, because metaphysical question goes even further. Not everything that is natural. Some things are supernatural or preternatural. Anyway, this is how Aristotle thinks. So if this question never occurred, and from my knowledge it really never did occur in ancient times, and I'm not the first to notice this. Hegel was very adamant about it, for instance. There must be a reason for it. It is not natural then. It is not something, therefore, fundamental. What was fundamental question for Aristotle? Let's see. Well, it's easy. We have it in the first book of his Metaphysics. The question is the following. Why is there being... why the being in general, or cosmos, the world is in general, is such and such and not different? So the main question is not why it exists at all, because existence is presupposed. And please remember existence. I won't talk here much about it, but for your own further research, if you're interested, think about the existence, the einai of Greeks, or energeia. This is something that is not put in the question. Now Heidegger, to go back to him, claims that there is a certain ontological mood in human being that provokes the metaphysical question of Leibniz. And this mood he calls angst, or anxiety, whereas angst is a state of human being in which human being fears. That is to say, it doesn't fear a fierce dog, war, calamity, his wife, or graveyard. He fears. He just fears. It is fear of nothing, or fear of everything, if you like. This fear, that is to say, unease, let's say, something unheimlich in German. It's a very subtle word. Unfortunately, I don't have time here to go into it too much. This is the revelation of the being in general. That is to say, all beings in a certain state of mind, or a certain state that is also emotional in a way, reveal that there is nothing at their core, that there is no reason why being in general is. Because being in general, when taken as such, points to nothing. And this nothingness is what causes anxiety, angst. From this emerges metaphysical question, and Heidegger for himself wants to explore this nothingness, not being, but nothing, because the origin of being as being is obviously related to nothing. And Heidegger is very careful to avoid terms like cause, effect, but in fact you cannot remove them from philosophy, because automatic and natural reaction is to ask about causes, not to ask about something, because Heidegger's notion of being is such that he always tries to destroy any kind of natural terminology that was developed through ages, and always trying to project his own linguistic inventions back in the philosophers of antiquity he interprets. And he does it, in my opinion, in fact, like somebody making counterfeit money. I mean, this is something that can be demonstrated, but not at this point, of course, in this short podcast. I talked about it previously, a bit at length. Anyways, these two questions are obviously not the same also for one reason, namely that Aristotle's question is also related to ontological mood. And this mood he calls Taumazein, or wonder, sense of wonder. So sense of wonder comes about originally by noticing something that is not regular, some kind of a wonderful anomaly, as for instance, and he uses the example of myths. People love myths as children love stories, because myth in effect means story, because there is something extraordinary there, something that is not everyday occurrence, so makes people wonder. But the real wonder, mature wonder, comes from being at awe before the world in general, before being in general. So content of being that is grasped in this intuition of wonder is a positive content. It's not negative content as it is in Heidegger. And what Aristotle wants is then that to do analysis, which means untying of the knot. This is these Greek words must be understood in a proper sense, that is to say that they have very tactile qualities in their original meaning, because today when we talk about, for instance, analytical philosophy, it's a English, Austrian analytic philosophy, or American, it's complete opposite. Analysis as they understand it is diametrically opposed to Aristotle's notion. So this untying means taking a thread that is revealed by being in general, by wonder, and follow this thread to its origin. This is metaphysics. This is what he calls first philosophy. Of course, he didn't use the word metaphysics, but later people did. and some of them were really amended and added to Aristotle's insights. So I think it's legitimate to call this metaphysics, because even the meaning of the word can be applied to the form of knowledge Aristotle is interested in. So this is completely different. And what Heidegger calls metaphysics in his What is Metaphysics lecture is not in fact metaphysics. It's Heidegger's notion what metaphysics is. And this notion is a modern notion, because Heidegger, for one, wants to transcend modernity, but he's very modern himself. He wants to transcend modernity in the direction of future, of course, but in the way that he wants to project new possibilities in the future for humans. I avoid his term Dasein, being there. He uses for human. Dasein is in fact the existence, the esse, but Heidegger's is, in fact, it is Heidegger's way to avoid falling in the subjectivity, philosophy of subject. I don't think he succeeds, so I'm not helping him by using his peculiar terms, undefinable terms, by the way, because existence as Heidegger understands it, act of being as Heidegger understands it, is in fact incomprehensible, conceptually completely incomprehensible. So he talks about, for instance, hermeneutic of facticity, where you have to actively try to understand this incomprehensible being. It's a story in itself. I won't go now into that, but just to note why I don't use his term right here. I do think that he never left anthropological or humanist position in philosophy, because this is humanist. For instance, Leibniz's position is humanist in the sense that his question is in fact a question of theodicy, and theodicy is the justification of God. It's a precise opposite of the argument for God's existence, as is traditionally understood, ways to God's existence, as Thomas Aquinas would call them. It's a complete opposite, for a simple reason that it starts from man, from the needs of man, the need to comprehend, to conceptualize, to understand, and to justify on his own terms. Because in theodicy, as Leibniz is, God has to justify himself before man. This is diametrical opposite of the original approach. And this is what you get when you, in fact, start from man. You don't start from man in the midst of all. Already in Leibniz, we can see how man is, as a subject of everything, kind of extracted from the whole of being, and is losing a grip. So Heidegger understands this, but wants to transcend it rather in post-human sense, because he validates that they should have started from human, but now you have to go further instead of going back, which would be, in my opinion, completely proper procedure, that is to say, to remain in the past while always stepping out from it at the same time. This is something that is entirely possible in spiritual matters, in intellectual matters, but of course also the story in itself. So this question is not what I wanted to show here. This question that is supposedly metaphysical is not that metaphysical as it seems. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.